Welcome to Guts and Guns.
That feeling when you're just standing in your kitchen in Iowa or pulling out of your driveway in New York and you feel, well, entirely in control of your surroundings.
Oh, yeah. It's your house, your car, your appliances.
Exactly. It feels local. But the reality of our, highly connected world is that someone 2,000 miles away is likely holding the remote control to a staggering amount of your daily life.
It really is like the invisible string of the modern economy. I mean, we rarely see who's actually pulling it, but we feel the tension on that line every single day.
Yeah, and that invisible string is exactly what we're tracking down in today's deep dive. Because if you were driving to work in Ohio right now, you might think California state law has absolutely nothing to do with you.
Right. Why would it?
Exactly. But statistically speaking, California's rules likely dictated the exact type of engine in your car, the energy efficiency of your refrigerator, and even the chemical warning labels on the products you buy at your local hardware store.
It is wild when you really start looking at it.
It is. Our mission today is to unpack a massive, high-stakes war of regulation that is currently erupting over California's environmental authority.
And it is a full-blown war. I mean, we're looking at a stack of sources detailing how this battlefield has expanded way beyond state lines.
Right.
It's playing out in car dealerships, federal courtrooms, and corporate boardrooms across the entire country.
Now, before we really get into the mechanics of how this all works, we do need to set some ground rules for our discussion today.
Definitely. The sources we are looking at are, well, they're intentionally polarized.
Extremely. You have people who view California as this visionary savior, and you have people who view it as a complete regulatory tyrant.
Yeah.
And people on both sides are just furious.
The tensions are incredibly high right now.
So we want to make it very clear. We are not taking sides, nor are we endorsing any of these highly politically charged viewpoints.
Right. Our goal is simply to impartially report the facts and arguments contained in these sources.
Exactly. We just want to rip the lid off this machine, show you how the gears work so you can understand the big picture.
Because regardless of where you fall on the political spectrum or, what state you live in, the outcome of this legal showdown is going to impact your wallet, your business, and your environment.
So to understand the sheer scale of the lawsuits happening right now in 2026, I want to start by figuring out how one single state got this phenomenal amount of leverage. Like, how did California get their remote control in the first place?
Well, it really comes down to a concept economists call the California effect. And at its core, the California effect is just about gravity.
Economic gravity.
Exactly. California is the 5th or 6th largest economy in the entire world.
Yeah.
Not the country, the world. If they were an independent nation, they would literally outproduce the UK and India.
Okay, let's unpack this. So it's an economies of scale thing.
Yeah.
If you are a global manufacturer, you just don't want the logistical nightmare of running dual supply chains, right?
Right. It's just too expensive.
You aren't going to design one product for the California market and a separate, slightly dirtier or cheaper product for the other 49 states. You just build to the highest standard and sell it everywhere.
Precisely. But it is not just sheer market size doing the heavy lifting here. There is a very specific historical legal mechanism at play that gives California a truly unique weapon.
Okay, what kind of weapon?
Well, if we wind the clock back to the 1960s, California was choking on smog. I mean, the geography of the Los Angeles basin traps air pollution, and it was an absolute public health crisis.
Right, the smog photos from LA back then are insane.
Yeah, you couldn't see down the street. So in 1967, they passed the Mulford-Carrell Act to regulate air quality, and this was well before the federal government had fully stepped up to the plate.
Right, because the Federal Clean Air Act didn't actually pass until 1970.
Exactly. So when the federal government finally created those national standards in 1970, California basically raised its hand and said, hey, we already started, and our air quality is uniquely terrible.
So they needed a carve-out.
Yes. Congress granted California a special waiver. This waiver legally allowed California to set stricter tailpipe emission standards than the rest of the country.
Well, wait, a waiver just applies to California, right? How does that force a dealership in, say, Pennsylvania to change its inventory?
That is where the true multiplier effect kicks in. It is a provision called Section 177 of the Clean Air Act.
Section 177. Okay.
Right. Section 177 essentially says that other states don't have to spend years and millions of dollars inventing their own environmental standards. They are legally allowed to simply adopt California's stricter rules.
Oh, I see. It's like being in a massive high school classroom where one remarkably strict teacher decides to grade on a brutal curve.
Yeah, that's a good way to look at it.
Like the teacher bases everyone's score on the single highest achieving student in the room. And because of Section 177, other states can just voluntarily opt into that strict classroom.
And they have. Currently, 17 other states have opted in.
17, wow.
Yeah. When you combine California with those 17 states, you are looking at roughly 40% of the entire U.S. population.
That is massive.
It gets bigger. More importantly, that coalition represents over 1/3 of the total U.S. auto market.
So if you are Ford or Toyota, you aren't just failing in California if you ignore the strict teacher's grading curve. You are failing the test for nearly half the country. Everyone else in the class is forced to adapt to that standard just to pass.
Yeah, and if we connect this to the bigger picture, you can see why automakers and manufacturers actually end up lobbying the federal government to just adopt California's standards nationally.
Wait, the car companies ask for stricter rules?
Sometimes, yeah, because they crave regulatory certainty above all else. A great historical example of this was back in 2009. The Obama administration essentially aligned the federal fuel economy standards with California's greenhouse gas rules.
Oh, because the industry didn't want a split market.
Exactly. The auto industry preferred one strict national rule over a fractured, chaotic market where they have to sell different cars in Nevada than they do in California.
And we see this play out in everyday life all the time, completely outside of the auto industry too. Like, think about Proposition 65, which California passed back in 1986.
Oh, the warning labels.
Yes. If you have ever bought a bag of coffee or a power tool or even a piece of furniture and noticed that tiny little warning label saying the product contains chemicals known to the state of California to cause cancer or birth defects.
Right.
That is Prop 65.
Right.
And you see those labels in Florida, in Texas, in Maine, everywhere.
Because manufacturers absolutely refuse to design separate packaging just for California. I mean, it's a logistical nightmare.
Yeah, they'd have to sort everything perfectly at the warehouses.
Right. So they either reformulate the product globally to avoid the label entirely, or they just slap the warning label on everything that goes out the factory door, regardless of where it's being shipped.
The strict teacher grades the whole class. But that brings us to the reality of today, April 2026. You push a market that hard for that long, and eventually the class pushes back.
Oh, they're pushing back hard.
Yeah, the strict teacher is now facing a full-blown rebellion from both the federal government and massive industrial sectors. We are experiencing severe regulatory whiplash right now.
The escalation we are seeing is honestly unprecedented. Just a few weeks ago, in March of 2026, the U.S. Department of Justice and the Department of Transportation filed a massive federal lawsuit against California.
Okay, what exactly are they targeting?
Their specific target is California's zero-emission vehicle mandate, which effectively acts as a total ban on the sale of new gas-powered cars by 2035.
I want to pause on that because the mechanics of this lawsuit are really surprising. Why is the Department of Transportation involved? If this is an argument about air quality and tailpipe emissions, shouldn't the EPA be the one suing?
That is the brilliant and, well, highly controversial legal maneuver the federal government is using here. They are not arguing about air quality directly.
They aren't.
No. They are using a law called the Energy Policy and Conservation Act, or EPCA. The federal government is arguing that EPCA gives them, and only them, the exclusive authority to set fuel economy standards.
Wait, I'm trying to connect the dots here. How does a law about fuel economy override a law about emissions?
Well, the feds are arguing that reducing tailpipe emissions is inextricably linked to fuel economy.
Oh, I see.
Their logic is that you cannot mandate a zero-emission vehicle without fundamentally dictating how or if that vehicle consumes fuel.
Right, because an EV uses zero gas, which is technically the ultimate fuel economy.
Exactly. Therefore, they are telling the courts that California's emission rules are effectively illegal mileage requirements.
Wow.
They're saying California essentially dressed up a fuel economy mandate in the clothing of environmental policy, and by doing that, they overstepped into exclusive federal territory, completely regardless of their Clean Air Act waiver.
That is a fascinating legal wedge. I mean, if California loses that case, they completely lose their power to lead the nation's auto market toward electrification.
They absolutely do.
But as huge as that DOT lawsuit is, the sources highlight an even bigger strike that happened a month earlier, in February 2026. The federal EPA formally rescinded something called the 2009 endangerment finding.
Yes. And that is the absolute earthquake in this regulatory war.
I read through the summaries on this, but I need you to explain the underlying logic here. How does rescinding a single scientific document from 2009 threaten the entire modern climate agenda? Are they just arguing over the science?
Oh, no, they are doing much more than arguing over the science. They are completely dismantling the legal architecture.
Okay, how so?
The 2009 endangerment finding is the legal bedrock that officially classifies greenhouse gases as pollutants that endanger public health.
Right.
Under the Clean Air Act, the EPA cannot just arbitrarily decide to regulate something. They must first formally find that the substance endangers the public.
Wait, so by targeting the 2009 endangerment finding, they aren't just arguing over car parts, they are attempting to legally erase the scientific justification for almost all climate regulation.
Exactly. It is the foundational permission slit. By rescinding that finding, the federal government is legally declaring that carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases do not pose a danger that requires federal regulation.
Wow. That changes everything.
It does. Without that finding, the EPA itself loses the underlying legal justification to enforce sweeping climate rules. And here's the kicker for California. If the federal EPA doesn't have the authority to regulate greenhouse gases, then California's waiver to set stricter greenhouse gas standards instantly evaporate.
Oh, man. So they aren't just snipping a few branches off the tree here. They are attempting to pour concrete on the roots.
It is a surgical strike on the very foundation of environmental law. Naturally, California and a coalition of 24 states immediately sued to restore it. And that battle is going to be vicious.
But the battlefield isn't limited to passenger cars and tailpipes, right?
Yeah.
The sources show this war has actively spilled over into corporate boardrooms and the national freight network.
Yes, it is reaching everywhere.
Let's talk about what California is doing with corporate transparency, specifically Senate Bill 253 and Senate Bill 261.
Right. So California realized that regulating the cars on the road just wasn't enough if the massive corporations building the cars or selling the goods were hiding massive carbon footprints.
Makes sense.
So they mandated that any company operating in California and making over $1 billion in revenue has to publicly disclose their full carbon footprint.
And we aren't just talking about the electricity bill at their headquarters. We are talking about their entire supply chain, right?
Right. It's called Scope 3 emissions. And think about what this means in practice.
Okay.
If you are a massive retailer headquartered in the Midwest, but you do business in California, and let's be honest, every billion-dollar company does business in California.
Obviously, yeah.
You have to audit and report the emissions of every third-party truck that delivers your goods and every independent factory overseas that makes your products.
I can imagine corporate compliance officers just tearing their hair out over this. Like, how do you even track the emissions of a contracted delivery driver in Ohio if your headquarters is in Illinois, just to satisfy a law in California?
It's a massive undertaking.
So naturally, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and several other massive business groups sued, and their argument here is rooted in the First Amendment, which I found completely unexpected.
It is a very clever legal argument, honestly.
Okay.
The business groups claim these disclosure laws are a form of compelled speech.
Compelled speech? Like forcing someone to say something?
Right. They are arguing that California is illegally forcing private corporations to make politically charged statements about climate change against their will.
Right.
And on top of that, forcing them to spend millions of dollars in auditing fees just to generate that speech.
And the current status of these laws is a complete mess. As of early 2026, a Ninth Circuit Court issued a temporary injunction blocking SB 261, which is the law requiring companies to report on their climate-related financial risks. Yeah. But the court allowed SB 253, the law requiring the actual supply chain emissions reporting, to proceed.
Which is causing absolute chaos. You have a split decision, and the first major reporting deadline for companies under SB 253 is rapidly approaching on August 10th, 2026.
But notice what California accomplished here. Regardless of the lawsuits, they effectively created a national standard for corporate disclosure. Before the Federal Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC, could even finalize its own federal rules.
Yeah, California totally front-ran the federal government on this.
Exactly. And they are applying that exact same pressure to the logistics industry with a mandate called Advanced Clean Fleets.
Oh, the trucking rule.
Yeah, this is a rule forcing trucking companies to transition from diesel to electric trucks. And the trucking industry is pushing back aggressively, arguing that the technology simply isn't there yet for heavy haulers, and the national charging infrastructure just doesn't exist.
Right, they're saying you can't mandate a transition if the plugs aren't there to charge the trucks.
Here's where it gets really interesting. I was trying to figure out how California enforces a trucking rule on an independent driver from out of state. Then it hit me. The ports. Think of the ports of LA and Long Beach as a bouncer at an incredibly exclusive, highly lucrative club.
Oh, that is the perfect analogy. Because an enormous percentage of the entire nation's imported cargo enters the country through those specific coastal doors.
Right. So the bouncer stands at the gate and says, if your truck isn't clean, it doesn't get in to pick up the cargo.
Simple as that.
That effectively forces a trucking company based in the Midwest to completely change its fleet if it wants a piece of that coastal economic action. The bouncer controls the whole block.
Which perfectly illustrates why the rest of the country is experiencing a profound national identity crisis regarding California's actions.
Yeah, people are incredibly divided.
Right. When you have a bouncer in Los Angeles dictating the business model of a trucking company in Illinois, or a tech hub in Silicon Valley forcing a farmer in Iowa to pay more for a compliant tractor, the nation fractures. You end up with two completely different realities.
Let's explore that divide. If you look at how the progressive blue states view this, California is a visionary. They see the state as the laboratory of democracy and the ultimate green wall protecting the planet from federal inaction.
And they have powerful economic data to back up that perspective. Advocates point out that California has successfully decoupled economic growth from emissions.
Meaning they get richer without getting dirtier.
Exactly. Historically, California's GDP has often grown faster than the national average, while its total emissions have simultaneously fallen. For them, it is absolute proof of concept. Stringent green policies and a robust economy can totally coexist.
But then you cross state lines and you hear the exact opposite. Red states, conservative leaders, and major industrial sectors view California's actions as regulatory imperialism.
Right. Their argument is fundamentally about democratic representation. I mean, a factory worker in Texas or a farmer in the Midwest didn't get to vote for the California Air Resources Board.
Obviously not.
Yet those unelected officials in Sacramento are making decisions that dictate the viability of their local factories. This intense resentment really fuels the ongoing Texas versus California business migration rivalry.
Oh, we see that all the time in the headlines.
Yeah, conservative states actively use California's strict rules as a weapon to lure businesses away, pitching themselves as havens from overregulation.
Then there are the skeptics who focus purely on the math, right? The affordability warning. These are people who might actually fully support the environmental goals, but they're looking at the realities of aging infrastructure.
Right, the cost factor.
Yeah. California's electricity rates are anywhere from 50 to 100% higher than the national average. When you force aggressive electrification mandates onto an expensive aging grid, they argue you drive the fundamental cost of living up to a breaking point.
Which ties directly into what might be the most fascinating dynamic in all of the sources we reviewed. The internal dissent.
The pushback from inside the state.
Yes. The loudest pushback isn't just coming from Texas or Washington, D.C. It is coming from inside California itself.
Right, the equity critique.
Yeah.
Social justice groups and local community advocates are raising their voices, arguing that these pioneer policies have historically benefited wealthier, whiter communities while leaving minority and low-income communities behind.
What's fascinating here is the painful irony of it all. If you have a high income, you get lucrative subsidies to buy a new electric vehicle, and you can afford to put solar panels on your roof to offset those high electricity rates.
But if you can't afford that.
Right. If you are low income, you are often stuck driving an older gas car, paying higher fuel prices, and living near the industrial hotspots, warehouses, and freeways where the heavy diesel equipment is still operating.
So the people who can least afford the transition are left breathing the exhaust of the infrastructure, building the green economy.
Exactly. This internal pressure is forcing California to pivot heavily toward environmental justice mandates, trying desperately to ensure the green transition doesn't just replicate historical inequalities.
So what does this all mean for the average person just trying to pay their utility bills and get to work?
Well, the entire nation is treating California as a massive beta tester. They are watching in real time to see if a modern, highly complex economy can actually fully decarbonize without crushing the middle class or leaving its most vulnerable citizens behind.
And right now, that beta test is facing its ultimate legal reckoning. The stakes of everything we have discussed today point toward an almost inevitable Supreme Court showdown.
It really feels unavoidable at this point.
It does. The core question facing the justices is whether the United States will operate under one unified national environmental standard regulated solely by the federal government, or if California will be legally allowed to continue running a parallel green economy that drags the rest of the free market along with it.
And the outcomes of the DOJ lawsuit over EVs, the battle to restore the endangerment finding, and the First Amendment challenges to corporate disclosure, they won't just settle a few 2026 headlines.
Right.
They will legally define the boundaries of state power versus federal power for the next century.
But I want to leave you with a lingering thought, something to chew on that goes beyond the gavels and the legal briefs.
Okay, what is it?
Let's say the federal government wins it all. Let's say the Supreme Court completely strips California of its authority. They strike down the corporate mandates, they permanently revoke the Clean Air Act waiver, and they legally end the California effect. Is the genie already out of the bottle?
That is the ultimate question of momentum. Global companies and major automakers have already spent billions upon billions of dollars and years of intense research and development, retooling their entire global supply chains to meet California's standards.
Right. Would a massive global automaker really spend billions more to revert back to older, dirtier technology just because a court in Washington, D.C. said they were legally allowed to?
Probably not.
Or has California's immense economic gravity permanently shifted the free market, regardless of what the judges decide? Even if you manage to take the remote control away from California, the channel might already be permanently changed.
You can change the law overnight, but reversing a global supply chain is like trying to turn around an aircraft carrier in a bathtub. The market has its own momentum now.
It is going to be incredibly fascinating to watch this unfold over the coming months. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the California regulatory war. We hope we gave you the context you need to look past the polarized headlines and understand the invisible strings shaping our national economy. Keep questioning the world around you, stay curious, and we'll catch you next time.
We hope you enjoyed this week's episode. Tune in again.